On behalf of IIT School of Applied Technology, who is actually a co-sponsor of this event, I'd like to extend our welcome. And on behalf of Dean Robert Carlson, our Dean, welcome to this event. We're very glad to have you here. As noted, I am I'm not the interim associate director anymore. I'm the associate director of our Center for Cybersecurity and Forensics Education. And part of our task is to intersect with organizations like this to ensure that we have optimal knowledge being conveyed to our students so that when they study cybersecurity, they're studying it from the current industry perspectives. We have a panel today that we intended to put together a panel of chief information officers and chief information security officers to give you the concept of cybersecurity at the senior executive level in the cybersecurity realm. So that's kind of the background of the idea behind the panel. That's why it's at C-level. I'm going to introduce the panel members that are in your book first, and then I'll introduce our panel members who stepped in at the last minute, and I very much appreciate their doing that. I'd like to introduce Maurice Dawson, who is the director for the Center of Cybersecurity and Forensics Education at Illinois Institute of Technology. He is also an assistant professor and previously, and this is the relevant part for this particular panel, was the Chief Information Officer of Reynolds Research and Technology Corporation in Huntsville, Alabama. So everybody that you see here, has had senior executive roles in cybersecurity or in IT. One of the distinguishing features of our department in the university is that all of our faculty members in our department, Information Technology and Management, have worked in the field, and we won't hire faculty members if they haven't. So that's Maurice and Ophir Trigalo. Ophir is the Vice President and Chief Information Officer at Illinois Institute of Technology. So he runs basically everything in the IT world for us. He actually just recently assumed responsibility for the School of Applied Technology. Even we had been running our own IT operation, but now that's also under his office now. And he was the 2018 Chicago CIO of the Year. So we're very pleased to have Maurice and Ophir. Now, on our panel, we also had Mark Lass, who is the Chief Information Officer at Chicago State University, and he unfortunately had a traffic accident. He's okay, but he was not able to make it here today. So I asked a couple people to step in, and they actually both stepped up, and they're both here, even though I'm only using one of them. So, hey, thanks, TJ, for being here anyway. David Ogbolumani is a Chief Cybersecurity and Information Privacy Officer for IT Security Consultants, and he previously was the Director of Global IT Security and Chief Information Security Officer at Kellogg Company. He's also an alum of our master's degree program from our department. So, David, thank you for stepping in. And Anatoly Bodner, right here next to me, is an associate partner at IBM X-Force Cloud Security Services here in Chicago. We had Ravi, who was going to be here as a CISO at IBM, and unfortunately he was not able to be here today, so Anatoly has stepped in for him. So thank you guys very much for being here. Oops. I'll change my slide here. So what I'd like each of you to do is, now that I've talked about who you are and what your role is, I was going to let you do that, but I think I hit that already pretty well. How about just go down the line and have each person briefly discuss their philosophy on cybersecurity at the enterprise level?
Should we start?
Sure, might as well.
Perfect. So the perspective that I bring forward comes from two different angles. The first angle comes from the opportunity that I've had a little bit earlier in my career to be an information security officer for a consultancy organization overseeing North America security. And the other perspective is the perspective of the consultancy side of the house, where even the capacity that I'm in now, working with executives on structuring various cybersecurity programs, be it data security, application security, and cloud security primarily. I think the objectives of an organization, and oftentimes these objectives are lost along the journey, is really try to first understand the business before you even put together a strategy on how to defend that organization. Because once you understand the business, you are able to understand the threats that are imposed on that organization. You might be dealing with a healthcare organization, a financial services organization, a brokerage firm, a refinery. They all have different business models. They all vary in what they find to be valuable assets, their crown jewels. They all look at risk differently. So understanding their business and being ingrained in their business gives you a perspective, firsthand perspective on the threats, which then you can quantify as risks and develop effective countermeasures that are prioritized in accordance to what matters most for those organizations. And oftentimes we see a very black and white approach saying, hey, we're going to structure cybersecurity in a matter against a specific framework with very little context of the actual organization. And that's when it starts losing effectiveness. So the biggest takeaway from my perspective for this point is certainly tailor your cybersecurity program to the organization itself, not just its risk posture, not just its risk tolerance, but also towards really what it aims to protect.
So my background comes from mainly defense and aerospace, and so there the requirements are very different. So there, where our mission is to support the warfighter and make sure that the warfighter is able to successfully complete his mission. So for me, a lot of the requirements that we got were strictly Department of Defense, other government agencies, and so it was translating those requirements into actual products and making sure that those products would be effective and work from an engineering perspective. And so my viewpoint is actually understanding whatever framework is applicable, those requirements, and actually translating those requirements to actionable products and services.
So as a CIO in higher ed, it's an interesting balance of how you are making an attempt to comply with all the regulations as well as academic freedom, bring your own device and so on. And so the real question I'm always asking myself is, where is the balance between the need to provide the community with the ability to conduct their actions and still secure the environment? Make sure that the data is secure, that we don't have incidents that we are regretting, and so on. And the ability to truly move in a very harsh manner on the community is not, it's not a very viable option. So you need to use a lot of smarts and a lot of finesse in driving policies and driving new rules and regulations to the community as we're moving forward.
Just like Anatoly, my background is both in industry and in consulting. There are two things that guide me. The first is risk, and the second is value. So when you go into any organization, you have to understand what risk does my particular vector and does my particular institution face. For example, when I was the Chief Information Security Officer at a Kellogg company, the company was very interested or more interested in how to protect its recipes, you know, some of those big intellectual property that it has. But those are not the only things that the company are really facing in terms of the biggest risk. The biggest risk was the fact that they were collecting so many data from different organizations and different individuals, and if they were to lose this data, they would have been much more susceptible to some of the brand damages that they could suffer, especially for a company like that, you know, that was looking out for its brand. The second thing is value. Information security has to demonstrate a certain level of value. The value it's very difficult to be able to quantify this in terms of things like ROI that business is able to understand. But when you couch this in terms of the damage that your brand or your organization can have if you do not actually have the proper controls in place, as well as how security can be an enabler so that you can be able to fulfill some of the missions in your organization. Most of us know that, at least I can imagine that in every organization here, including the public institutions, you know, you have to go through an audit. Most of those audits depend on technical systems, which has the data that fundamentally is going to yield the values during all these exercises. So how are you able to tie security into that? If you have very good security, it helps the process. If you have very poor security, it affects it. And just before I leave, one of the things that we're seeing in the industry now is most organizations are demanding that anyone who holds their data should be able to have some type of proof that they have acceptable security practices. Organizations are asking for either SOC 2 reports or for ISO 2001 reports. So if you don't have these controls in place, it can actually affect the level of business that you're able to generate, as well as if you're able to have some breaches, in order to be able to demonstrate that you actually had some decent level of security practices in place that might be able to protect you. So I look at security from the perspective of what risk do I face and what value does it bring to the table?
For the most part, what I'm going to do with rest questions is just toss them out and let you guys fight over them. So the next thing I would like us to discuss here is one of the big issues in cybersecurity at an executive level is the fact that it's the responsibility of the CISO and the CIO to sell cybersecurity to senior management in the organization as a value-added investment. So how do you go about that?
Well, maybe I have the easiest job here. As a university with engineering, computer science, and a cybersecurity program, it will not only create financial damage, it will create a significant reputation damage to the university and will put IIT in an awkward position to promote our cybersecurity programs to our prospective students and learn and being on the front page of the news. And so that is a part of the dialogue. Yes, there is always the financial risk, there is always the regulations and exposure, but there is also a high level of reputational risk, and it's effective. So,
yeah, in some industries you don't have a choice. Like Department of Defense, when we worked with like unmanned aerial vehicles. So if we were not compliant with certain particular regulations or certifications, they would actually ground our actual aircraft in a battle zone. So imagine getting a call, in midnight from some angry colonel. He's like, "Hey, Mo, you're not compliant. We've already called your leaders or whatever. We had to ground this UAV." And yeah, we're in the middle of Baghdad. We're fighting a war, so you need to have this fixed. And so that is the big ordeal, because a lot of times they realize that we would pull all these items out in the war, and there would be, people would intercept actual, intelligence, information, all because it was unencrypted. They would get to see, okay, well, let's find out the flight plans. If a vehicle actually crashed, air vehicle crash, they could actually reverse engineer that vehicle because they could see everything that was inside it. Those no anti-tamper mechanisms in place. So these are very stringent requirements. Now in the commercial sector, there's not such thing. If something happens where information is leaked, the entire organization is not going to be told, immediately stop working. Whereas in the Department of Defense or the military, the repercussions are serious. It can cause grave or serious damage to the country. So I think, in my perspective, working in that particular sector, it was a lot easier because, the requirements were you can't do business. You want to do business in this particular sector, and you don't want to have your vehicles or your technologies not used in the war, then you need to make sure you're compliant.
That's a very, 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 very valid point. So there's multiple schools of thought on this, right? The first that was just mentioned is cost of doing business. So if an organization, being an entity, a government entity or a supplier to the government, or a regulated organization such as Fiserv, it is just the cost of doing business. That's one perspective. The headlines certainly work in our favor as an industry because the board is aware, the board is asking questions, and in fact, there were recent polls. Number one concern, 60% of 60% top one concern is cybersecurity of the organizations. Separate point, and that's the point that all of us in the services industry have to deal with, is how do you sell that additional value in an organization or to an organization of cybersecurity? And the point that resonates both from our side, but also as a point that can very effectively be leveraged in your organizations, is cost takeout. At the end of the day, security weaknesses or weaknesses in security postures can be looked at as defects. Defects impair either functionality or features, or reliability, or uptime of your products, services, or the entire business model. At the end of the day, if you look at these defects, and if you look at, and actually if you couple that with one of the points in the previous panel about the elimination of defects early in the process, if we're talking, for example, application security, there's been actual measurements on the cost benefits of doing security upfront in the software development lifecycle, as an example. Upwards between 20 to 50 times relative to the cost of implementation is the cost of security remediation. So remediation always costs more. So if you can demonstrate that this is how much organizations in your specific verticals or across the board are spending on remediation, then you can build an effective business case to say, hey, our investment in security is a cost takeout mechanism, because if we couple that with our annual rate of occurrence from our risk calculations, we can very effectively justify making a spend, which generally would be a factor of multiple times less than being compared to the cost of remediation itself.
So I think there are two things that boards understand. They understand something called regulation, and they understand money. So if you're able to press somewhere between those two buttons, you have a winning argument. How many people here have been affected by GDPR? Show of hands. No. Okay, so we know that, right? Now, boards understand the impact that those will have on them, and those impacts will go directly to their bottom lines. When you get fined $400 million and you're Google, let me tell you one thing, as much as you make, you still feel that very impact. So people understand the fact that if we do not fulfill our regulatory obligations, we're going to be in trouble. And I can tell you that board members, especially the independent board members, don't want to have anything to do with that. So that's one. The other thing is in terms of money. Now, negative news can affect a company's valuation. The market reacts very, very quickly on that. In 2011, I had a breach, right? And the breach had to be reported to the SEC. Right. And when the SEC got wind of it, guess what? That's the market right there. The market builds in a setting factor into all those things. So it affects you. Your partners, people that you have trading relationships with, they're going to get very difficult with you. We had extranets that were sharing data between organizations, and all of a sudden they were saying, you know what, wait a minute, we need to start evaluating these things. So you have some of those drivers that will make the board sit up. But there is one particular case that most people are not talking about because the FTC has been quietly working on it. It's a 2015 case. It's called the FTC versus Wyndham. So for the very first time in American jurisprudence, the courts found out that you could be held liable for using unfair trade practices if your cybersecurity practices are not up to stuff. So what happened to Wyndham was they had a bunch of servers that they weren't patching, they had very poor practices, and it led Russian hackers to be able to hack into their systems. And they stole data that belonged to consumers, so consumers were harmed. They went against the FTC in the district court, they lost. They went to the Court of Appeals. The Court of Appeals affirmed that very decision. So the FTC is getting very, very strong on companies, They want to make sure that you have those practices in place. So if your board understands that they need to be up to snuff, I think they are more likely to be able to bring out money. And we can all agree now that any board that does not consider cybersecurity as a very strong initiative or at least a concern is probably not living up to its fiduciary duties right now.
Okay, thank you. Given the level of where people in this panel have been, one of the differences is that things elevate from just management of cybersecurity, which I teach all the time, to actually being concerned with governance. So how do you structure cybersecurity governance in an organization to ensure that we're paying the proper attention to it, not just from the worker bee level, but from the top levels of the organization?
I guess I can go on this first. So from the governance perspective, governance itself is a very complicated factor within organizations. Ultimately, there has to be a tremendous level of visibility for your cybersecurity initiatives that serve as a feedback mechanism all throughout the organization, both vertically and horizontally. In terms of where the security organization sits, there's a lot of talk on separation of duties. There's a lot of talk on potential prevention of conflict of interest between cybersecurity teams within organizations and other teams within the same organization. Take, for example, a situation where security may be reporting up to the IT chain rather than compliance or risk, right? IT is generally tasked with optimizing or minimizing cost, increasing productivity, improving performance, while cybersecurity is viewed as an impediment to it. So being a subset of the IT organization potentially may influence its decisions and its abilities to actually execute its mission statement. Now, there's also central of excellence concept that should be embedded within organizations from the governance perspective, right? So it's the ability to stand up that central authority, central set of policies, standards, and controls, and certainly letting other teams and other business units have their deviations in accord to their specific requirements, but the overall governing body has to be consistent, has to be a direct feedback loop and report up across the organization, both from the board level all the way down to the individual contributor level.
Yeah, so with regards to governance, I'm actually in the badge of a company that is doing things differently. The reporting structure really matters a lot. I'm someone who has reported to the CIO, so I know that when you report regularly to the CIO, there are many things that do not live within the bounds of where you are. There are things that do not get to where they're supposed to get to. But if the reporting structure is outside the CIO's organization, then it's more likely to get the visibility that it requires. For example, this company, Underwriters Lab, is a private company. They have revenues of over $2 billion a year. They've restructured it in such a way that the CISO reports outside the IT organization. Now, what it does is it brings in a lot of confidence into the process because the CISO has now battled the CIO to make sure that those controls are in place. As long as the funding is there so that some of the works can be done, it is probably the most preferred way, in my views, to have the CISO report outside the organization. Now, the CISO is also taking an increased level of importance in many organizations. In fact, in Goldman Sachs right now, their former CISO is on the board of Goldman Sachs. Now, that's a big deal. I was at an event, not long ago, a Wall Street event, a Wall Street Journal event, where the CISO at the Sloan Kettering Hospital was one of the people there. So the level of importance that is attached to the CISO in terms of the structure of your organization is really, really important because the CISO is someone who has a lot of knowledge on where the hidden skeletons are. They know where the controls are weak within the organization. They know where they are struggling, right? And as long as they have the power and they're empowered to be able to bring these things up, then it helps. Now, who the CISO ultimately reports to is important. So in some instance, when the CISO reports to maybe the legal counsel or some other person who is outside of the IT organization, it's actually preferred because they usually have a direct contact with at least the audit committee of the board. So the CISO and someone who is probably the chief audit executive are reporting to the same person. And that person has the level of influence that you need. In boards, it's a matter of who is going to listen to you. When I was at the Keller company, very big company, we had the ears of the chairman of the audit committee. Not the entire board, but the audit committee had a very strong position because they were also in charge of risk within the organization. So whatever we decided with them was taken to the board. So you had an advocate in the board who was pushing for what you needed. And we had an instance when we wanted a head count of, E&Y did a study for us. We wanted 27 people in the organization. We ended up paring it to 13. And then when we went to ask, we were surprised that we got everything that we wanted. And we were saying, well, why didn't we ask for what we really wanted? We asked for what we thought we were going to get, So the governance structure in the organization is really going to affect the way that you handle things. So if we're able to get the CISO out of the IT organization, depending on the organization, I think it's going to help security a lot.
Okay, thanks, David. Let's move on to another issue here. One of the things that has to be dealt with by people at the senior level in cybersecurity is staffing the cybersecurity function within the organization. So the question is, how do you do that? How do you staff cybersecurity? From a senior level perspective, what are the challenges involved in staffing your cybersecurity function?
So there's a few things. So in the city of Chicago, there's 11,000 open jobs right now in cybersecurity. If you look at the number of schools that are accredited by the National Security Agency, Department of Homeland Security, there are approximately 250 within the entire country. Now, if you look at purely the numbers for four-year colleges in the state of Illinois, you're looking at an estimated 115. So you can see there is an issue right there. And every university is offering cybersecurity. They may not have the appropriate staff or the actual classes needed for students to understand cybersecurity. So the workforce issue is an extremely important issue. So what that means is that individuals, leaders will need to work directly with schools to have a pipeline for those individuals, because these people are graduating, these students are graduating with multiple opportunities, right? They're having maybe 10 offers, and a lot of them are paying $75,000. That is the average here in the Chicagoland area. And so companies have to start working with these particular universities early in advance. And then for those that are already working and maybe not have a strong cyber background, there has to be a training program to sort of convert these individuals to get them familiar with cyber. There's also a number of professional organizations that do IT certifications, IC Squared, ISACA, stuff like that, EC Council. But it's a big issue. The workforce right now is a big issue. And it just means that companies have to be much more involved in actually the talent pool and helping grow that talent pool. At the last organization that I was at as a professor, we actually had a bank, a large bank that will actually offer scholarships to students doing cybersecurity. And so this was a way that our institution would be able to, we would actually provide those students, those graduates, to that bank first. We say, all right, well, we have so-and-so graduating, here are these students. Now, organizations like the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, they offered internships. So the students that were working with NGA, they actually had first dibs on them. They worked with them. They said, all right, well, these are our students for 3-4 years. We're paying for the school, we're offering security clearance. The first 3-4 years, they worked for us. And then after that, they have met their obligation.
I think organizations need to start looking at talents from internally to see those who can be developed in such a way that they can provide value on information security end. Like Maurice said, it is a jungle out there. Even the talents at $75,000, you'll be really surprised that those talents are really not as competent as you will even expect. And that's how bad the market is. Many organizations are doing one thing, and that is trying to outsource as much as they can, trying to use managed security services, And you'll find out that internally, you are not going to be able to have the level of talent you need to manage your information security program. I can almost assure you about that, even if you're the US government. So how do you go about doing that? Managed security services will be an option, Getting people from within the organization. Now, why I advocate getting people from within the organization is so important is that half of what we battle depends on our own organizational knowledge. The 80-20 rule still applies. Most of the things that will hang you are those low-hanging fruits that you fail to do. And those are things that many people from a very basic level can be able to address. So how you grow your talents from within, and also how you encourage the talents you have. I still hear companies saying, oh yeah, no, we don't have money for you to go to training. Oh, we can't do this and that, And yet they'll bring in someone who is earning $120,000 a year, Things that do not really make sense. So how do you actually boost the level of talent you have from within? Because you're going to have to fight the battle in two ways. You're going to have to need numbers, and you're also going to have to need to increase the level of competency of those people whom you have within your organization. The talent shortage is not going to abate even in the next 10 years. It's still going to be a struggle. So companies have to be innovative in how they can be able to retain talents. And this also goes back to your general philosophy about an organization, how you retain your staff, how you deal with people. And the number one reason why people leave is because they don't like the bosses, and that's true. So all those little things that have to do with people skills, things that are not necessarily security related, will help you to be able to maintain the level of talents you have if you're able to nurture them correctly.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. In general, I think that cybersecurity is one aspect, but almost in anything that you're going to look, you're short-staffed. Yes, and so the challenge is not how to only increase the staff, but how do you manage the staff you have, which is exactly your point, and are you able to build additional expectations and specify them as the job of securities of every single employee you have. And so that's the general approach. Is we do have dedicated staff to deal with it, but we also have very well-defined expectations from everybody as to what they ought to do to keep us secure and aware of the environment. And it's an issue of collaboration. The organization I have is structured by skills, and so there are a lot of handshakes, and so the communication and the collaboration is essential part of keeping us secure.
So these are all excellent points, and I don't want to sound like a broken record to reiterate those points. A couple of other points that I feel are very important to bring up as it pertains to talent. The enterprise cybersecurity marketplace is in competition with services organizations that are willing to pay top dollar, right? From that perspective, it's very difficult. As you mentioned, in Chicago, we have a ton of open spots. We have a little bit of a delta between what organizations are willing to pay, whether it's services, whether it's enterprise on the enterprise side. At the end of the day, it comes down to making sure you hire the right talent, not just talent. If you bring in, especially on the organizational leadership perspective, from the security perspective, if you bring in the wrong individuals, they will create toxic workplaces, and those toxic workplaces will subsequently work against your favor. Now, creating a positive work environment, giving employees flexibility, giving employees perks, allowing them opportunities to cross-train, bringing different capabilities to their table, saying, hey, I know you've been doing, let's say, SOC operations or incident response for X number of years. Would you like to try going into a different area of security? At least shadow those that are there. We want you to cross-train. We want you to learn. And that allows both you the opportunity to retain those individuals better, build better loyalty throughout the organization to ensure they stay with you, but also to attract additional resources. Now, reason why that's important is recruiting costs money at the end of the day, whether you're using internal recruiting, external recruiting. So if you can leverage natural, organic mechanisms of people using their social circles, using their interest areas to propagate the message of, hey, I work for this awesome company. I get to work on this awesome stuff, right? This word of mouth goes a long way in bringing in the right people, the very people we consider unicorns. They're very, very difficult to spot, and it's very rare for a recruiter to actually bring in somebody that we would consider a unicorn. But it's not rare for an exemplary individual who we're already investing into to bring in their peers, bring in someone they went to school with, bring in someone they go to meetup groups with, or share beers and talk about security in general. Last point on this, and the school element is absolutely essential. A way to identify talent that's curated early in the classroom, translating that into potential leaders in the security community. Within IBM, we have a very strong program for that. We actually partner up with a lot of schools to actually run what's called an early development, early professional program, where we actually have the capability to offer opportunities that a lot of these candidates wouldn't otherwise have, or their resumes would be lost in a pool in a job portal where there's a 50-50 odds. Maybe somebody will look at it, maybe somebody will not. So using those types of programs, we're able to offer these opportunities, pick the people that we would love to work with and curate them and help them along the way. So those programs pay dividends across organizations with no drawback or whatsoever.
Hey, Rick, I got a quick item. So what I used to do in the Maryland area, I would actually go speak at local universities, especially programs that had graduate programs that were accredited by NSA. And I would actually tell the professor, let me say your 5 top students, and let me talk with them, and I will do a preliminary assessment on actually offering them a job. I would talk to those students and say, all right, I am willing to hire you for 2 years, pay for a master's, get you as a government security clearance, but you need to give me 2 years. And so that's something I would use to recruit people, top people. So I've recruited a number of people that have, through that particular mechanism. It was easy for me, and it saved time in terms of actually going to job fairs. I'm going through a ridiculous resume database full of alphabet soup letters, and that was how I was able to cut recruiting costs a lot. But it meant that I actually had to go out to the school, work with the professor, and ask them, hey, give me your best people. And they didn't necessarily have the best GPA, but technically they were sound.
Yeah, let me just add one thing. When I was at Kellogg, we had a program where we had interns. So I will have an intern, every year. Now, the internship program, I think, was one of the best things that happened to me, at least for about 3 or 4 years consecutively. Unfortunately, not from IT, but from DePaul, I will get somebody from the networking department. And to Anatoly's point, it was one of the students, that will say, oh, here, I have this particular student who is good. Now, I first had somebody who used to manage the high school network, his own high school network. He was like the techie in his high school. So going to study computer science at DePaul, I could bring that person in. And he was very good. And you know how sharp some of these kids are? They can get into systems. They knew how to hack. They knew how to do a lot of things, So right there, I had somebody who was very technical. Next year, he brought in somebody. I could unfortunately only hire one intern. So if you have the ability to hire interns, IT is a very good place. You can come in there, you can get a student, and typically, when you're able to use the students for a couple of years, you could be able to give them an offer when they graduate, and get about maybe probably 3 years or 3 very good years out of a very good talent, So please consider that.
Thanks, guys. One of the hardest things about being a moderator is I can't answer the questions. I can only ask them, and I have lots of answers too, but I'm just going to keep going here. What would you say from the perspective of a CIO or a chief information security officer, what are the threats that keep those folks keep people in those roles up at night, as opposed to, your normal cybersecurity analysts? Everybody has a different perspective on what they see as the greatest concern and the thing that they're most, maybe not the greatest concern, the thing they're most worried about having to deal with. Okay, so that's probably the good way to put that.
All right, so I would say 0-day vulnerabilities. These vulnerabilities come out from one day to the next. Then the other issue is having a vulnerability found that you actually create a fix for, and that fix breaks your engineering solution. So, for example, one was actually making sure that a payload was encrypted. So we encrypted a payload, but we didn't meet the actual system requirements for availability. So now our availability pretty much sucked, and so we could not get our payload through in the time that was actually required. So you have one fix that creates several of the issues, and those aren't cybersecurity, but those are system performance, and those are the things that would keep me up at night.
I second that. One caveat on the vulnerabilities, some pain that I want to picture. I think a 0-day vulnerability in many circumstances and many issues is less risky than a known vulnerability that hasn't been patched in an asset that you don't know that you own, right? So from the C-level perspective, it's understanding what are your assets. It's being able to keep track of your assets. I would say unpatched vulnerabilities, certainly, and especially with the proliferation of cloud, proliferation of CI/CD pipelines launching their own containers and developers having free reign in launching VMs in your AWS and your Azure environments. That proliferation of assets that you don't necessarily have a good level of control on unless you've already planned ahead on how you're going to do it and provide them the platform they need to make it successful, that would be probably one of the biggest risks. Another one that I want to highlight is third-party risk and fourth-party risk, or supply chain risk in general. Things you don't necessarily have good control over unless you have a very good strategy for segmentation and sandboxing for your third-party vendors, and you have a very strong TPRM process, third-party risk management process, where you do due diligence. It's not a check mark, but it's an actual due diligence process. You actually assess them versus having somebody just go off a questionnaire. Yeah, do you have a segmentation? Yeah, do you have an IPS? Yeah, that doesn't work. So if you're trusting your data, if you're trusting your business process to a third party, and most importantly, if you're trusting access to your environment to a third party, be it cloud environment, be it on-prem environment, be it a hybrid environment, then you're putting a lot of faith in those third parties. And that would be, I think, also definitely up there in the top 1 or 2.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, the one thing that I believe is going to keep all of us up at night is if you have a breach. I don't know how many people have been through breaches, but I have managed breaches for organizations. And when I come in, right, you can spend 2 or 3 days, in a location without going out. So breaches is something that keeps one at night. And if you're in the manufacturing, right, I don't know how many people here who are in manufacturing, you need to be very careful about your risks, when it comes to some of your industrial control systems, the systems that control your automated, your automated robots, right? Because those are how you manufacture your products, how you ship, how you move things into your inventory. And anything that pertains to that is going to have a direct hit on your revenue. And in some cases, we're talking tens or hundreds of millions of dollars. So some of those systems are things that in my previous capacity kept me up at night, because there have been issues, where some things went wrong with the AGV vehicles, couldn't move inventory, some things were wrong with robots, and there were security related issues, And people tend to look at the plant network as different from the corporate network. So there are usually two different types of ITs, who are involved in that type of thing, But when anything goes wrong, it just intertwines and messes things up. So two things, breaches, and then if you're in the manufacturing industries, your industrial control systems,
Well, thank you, everybody. Some wonderful things here at this panel. Well, we still have a few moments left. I wanted to know if there are any questions from the audience for the panel. I think I have one right there. This one I actually get to answer because I teach this. I teach this. I actually have a 3-hour lecture on communicating technology to non-technology people that all of our students have to go through. And one of the key things I point out to them, and it's hard for them to grasp this, is nobody cares if it's Dell or IBM. They don't care. When you're selling whatever it is you're trying to convince your senior executive staff about, all they care about is what does it do for the company? How does it add value? Now, I think everybody up here clearly understands that because they've all been in that situation where they realize, hey, they don't care, whether it's HP or IBM or Dell. All they care about is how does it add value? How does it improve our working environment? How does it improve our bottom line? I'll let any of you guys to talk about that.
An interesting perspective on that. So in my professional cybersecurity experience in the years within, I found that the best communicators were those who did not come from a technology background. They may have been liberal arts students, they may have been sciences students, biology students, musicians, right? In fact, we have within IBM, we have a very large security testing organization, and I believe they did an interesting internal statistic that over 60% of the employees were musicians in that group, right? So in those types of scenarios, we can't be blinded to the fact that our unicorns don't have to come from a specific IT background. They could have been doing something else, but this may have been a passion, and there was a spark that fueled it, and they've progressed, and now here they are. So encouraging interests outside of the direct IT world is also a good thing, perhaps, for organizations to explore.
In the industry that I came from, the majority of people served in the armed forces. So everyone was used to how the government customer wanted to hear things. And so we all went through training, and of course, being in the military or armed services, you went through training as well on communicating that way to your particular customer. One of the biggest issues was those that worked in aerospace and defense, when they left and went to the commercial sector, the way of communicating was very different. You're not authoritative. The quick way of giving the answer and stuff like that, it just didn't work as well. So in aerospace defense, military type style, the way this gentleman to my right has just said it, you have to have more of a style and a way of communicating these elements that aren't very technical, but in a way that they understand. It's just translating. Like Ray said, you have to be able to translate things and know what is important for your actual end audience.
You have to be persuasive.
I do like that word.
Yeah, there's also what they call the language of business. If you speak the language of business, they will understand. In many cases, especially very early on, IT people were very technical. They were just like really above people. People did not understand what they were saying, and everything was always a no, 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 right? But I was very fortunate to have come from IIT, where I was able to study. In fact, I took classes in this very building as well, in both law and business. So I knew what was important, what the business people were looking for, what were some of those things that drove them, right? And if you're able to marry these, with some basic common sense thinking, and if you have the power of persuasion, as one of the people have said, then you're able to understand your audience and tailor things the way that they're going to understand. Because if your audience does not understand what you want, then you're going to have challenges, And the challenges are even going to be in terms of getting some of the capital appropriations that you need to be able to carry out some of the projects that you want to do.
Yeah, I'm curious about the actual background of those people because with you think about the people who end up being CIOs or technical leaders, a lot of them have technical education only. And so now a lot of people say, well, get an MBA so you actually understand the business part. So get an MBA so you can communicate with the individuals. And I think that's another big thing as well.
Yeah, so in general, I think that this is one of the issues, but it is not applicable only to cybersecurity. It's applicable to almost every single aspect of managing technology. You have to be able to talk the business. And so how do you prepare your staff to talk the business? I send them to training. And training of not technology or how to install something, but training of self-discovery and self-understanding of what's your strengths and where are opportunities for you to improve and how different people are addressing different aspects of things that you might be stuck. And this employee growth, and I think it is an essential instrument in us developing the next tier of leadership as they're coming up the hierarchy of the organization.
In the back there?
Okay, so even while the CISO sitting out of the organization, quite frankly, is more a virtual demarcation, because the CISO in most cases is probably sitting next to the IT people, right? So there's really not a lot of physical separation in terms of those barriers. Everything depends on an organization, what type of talents you have, the interrelationships between the people, the type of programs that are in place. Because in many organizations, there are programs in place, that can be able to move people from different areas. And I think somebody talked about that, right? So you really have to look at your organization. What do you have? What type of talents are in place, and how could there be some type of possible cross-training between these people? At the end of the day, this is something that has to do a lot more with management, than actually in terms of talent. So I think it's more a management challenge,
I'm going to let him add something, but we're just about out of time here.
Very,
So
very
actually,
quickly,
I've been told
and
we
I
are
wouldn't
out
be
of time.
bringing this up. I know we're at time, but I wouldn't be bringing this up if it wasn't directly relevant to your point. We've actually tried something at IBM very recently, which is a Champions program. And the Champions program, it's a co-developed program with a client of ours that we piloted it when we turned it into an actual offering, where we would develop a specific resource or a team of resources to be embedded in a specific line of business representing security that both come from that background, so they can speak the language, but also understand what the objectives are from a security point of view. So for example, embedding a security engineer within a development organization to talk as DLC security, talk OWASP, things that sort. Again, you have the background. That person represents the interest or the objectives of the security organization in those specific teams. It doesn't have to be a full-time job, but that kind of a liaison relationship, which in big organizations is generally considered a BISO of a form, works very, very effectively.
Okay, thank you. I want to thank our panel. I think they've had some wonderful perspectives. Some of us will be around the rest of the day, and if you have any individual questions or want to grab any of us, please feel free to do that. Thanks again.